believe we are starting with Neil. Thank you for joining us, Neil.
So Chairman, Commissioners, staff, it's a pleasure to be here this morning. I'm going to talk about a systematic utility framework, and really the objective is to help utilities and commissions think about how to get into this utility of the future for two reasons: to keep costs low and to mitigate risk. And really that's about involving a partnership of different solutions providers, but also for the end user, the customer, the public, the ratepayer, and so that they have increased visibility and that their rates are kept low. So before I actually get into the specifics of the framework, I think it's fitting to provide a little bit of background. So you've probably seen graphics like this before, Utility 1.0 and 2.0. And by the way, on that nomenclature, this does not indicate that the utility is sort of the only entity involved. In fact, Utility 2.0 is going to largely involve the customer, and it's going to largely involve new ways of thinking about financial prudence. And so my point here is saying that at a very, the old way, or sort of, it's very like an engineering line diagram. The roles are very clear. The second one is, it's round. There's different entry points of the grid edge, right? It involves the customer. It's complicated. And not to be forgotten, it's glossy. There's like a sales and marketing component to this. And so on the surface, very simplistically put, I mean, this is about moving from one-way power flow to multi-directional power flow. However, what I want to get at is a little bit below the surface, and that I think from a utility and commission's perspective, it's about moving from an orderly and controlled environment to one that feels a little bit more complex, a little bit more chaotic. So let's unpack that a little bit more. Let's put some color to this. So I would say the grid of the 1.0 grid looked like a black and white checkerboard from central station generation all the way to the customer. It was very orderly, very, controlled, and so now the distribution grid is starting to add some color. And the problem is that the color, the diversity of it is good, but there's some chaos right now. This looks like Post-it notes, right? Imagine these Post-it notes all over your screen or your office desk. There's an element of chaos that's part of the problem. So let's look at that sort of a little bit more systematically. So if we look at this quadrant, and let me just orient you to that a little bit. So going from the bottom to the top, you're moving from a state of lower complexity to higher complexity. And then from left to right, you're moving from lower order or organization to higher order. So if we put sort of where we are today and where we're going, I think the first thing you instantly see is that we're not moving towards lower order or lower complexity. We can take that one right off the table. So where we are moving is to a more complex world, but there's really two paths. And there's one that I'm calling a utility-led transition, and a second one I'm calling a market-led transition. Now, this doesn't mean that in one it's just the utility and the other one it's just the market. It's a matter of who is actually leading that transition. And the point I want to make here is there's a higher degree of order from the utility-led transition strictly because they have the infrastructure. They're an aggregator currently. If the market comes in and sort of does it independently, there's this storage solution, there's this solar solution. What will eventually happen, I anticipate, is that some aggregator will come in and move us back to a state of order. And so you can see, which path is more streamlined. And when you have more streamlined path, you have lower costs. So let's simplify this down even more. Let's take the bottom part of that quadrant off. So it's not an issue of complexity. We know it's going to get more complex. This is a question of order. So if the market drives it, we're going to have the picture on the left. It's a little bit chaotic, and I would say that it's going to, the picture will be completed, and then at some point, someone's going to come in and say, okay, we need to pivot the other. We need to pivot the other direction so that we can see the flowers, right? We can see what we're actually trying to go after. And what I'm trying to say is, why don't we start with higher order first? And I think that is done by the utility leading, but seeking partnerships with the solutions providers and seeking engagement with the customer. So easier said than done. And one other element that I think sometimes gets lost in the sort of higher technical conversation is the human factor. There's always humans involved with every decision. And so this is from the Kellogg School of Management. Three reasons why people typically resist change. The first one's clear, because they have a good argument. Okay, I'm not going to focus on that one. The second two are the ones I want to highlight. There's a human need for respect, and frankly, it's heightened during periods of change, a paradigm shift. And the other relevant factors are the historical, how long they've been at an organization, and the influence they carry in that organization. So in the utility industry, I think this is very relevant. And then feeling rushed, not enough time to digest the situation mentally and emotionally. I think we all think we're more logical beings than we really are. We make a lot of emotional decisions. But the point here is, let's not get lost in philosophy. How do we actually use this to have it be part of a systematic methodology? And there's really two things here. There's listening and being open to change, which involves all parties involved. And then also listening that people are heard. I personally, my background's sort of unique that I worked at a major renewables manufacturer and also the largest public power company in the world, in the nation, the Tennessee Valley Authority. And so I have both of those perspectives. I try to look at things very objectively. And the last is the reduced time-based stress. So we don't have to think this is Chicken Little, the sky is falling. Let's use that to develop a systematic, incremental approach. So I've given you a little bit of background on sort of why I'm going where I'm going. It's trying to bring order out of complexity, and I really think the key is simplicity. Let's get out of the technical weeds for a second to have a higher order, higher level path to get here. So I'm going to walk you through each four of these stages. The first is really about looking at the market and what's your mindset on this whole utility 2.0 evolution. Secondly, it's about the foundation you set. And some of the comments yesterday from utilities, you can see they're starting to get these guiding principles to drive them. Third, and this is where the most work happens, is the framework. What does this DER framework actually start to look like? Like, tell me tangibly. Don't tell me about all the challenges. What does this tangibly look like to get from here to there? And then finally, the last is the easiest. This is just project management. How do you execute? Executing, optimizing, refining. And the thing I want to point out here at the bottom is this human element, that these first two stages are really about listening and conversation, and really at the executive levels of utilities, and also listening to the various solutions providers, listening to the end-use customer. And I think the thing is that usually it can start from the right side. So you can pick piecemeal initiatives like, we should just pursue solar, or we should just pursue storage because that's sort of the hot button item. So let me start walking through the four of these just to make this more practical. So the first is about observing and identifying. I think three key signposts to me are the financial and generation market trends, especially in the renewable energy industry, the public policy, which started with PURPA, but there's many things that have led us to where we are. And most people agree that given the current state of politics, that this train has already left the station. And then changing consumer preferences. We don't have to belabor that point. But it gets down to, what are the key issues? They're about loss. There's three losses here. Loss of revenue, which was talked about earlier, from load defection, reducing relevance with the customer, and then lastly, limiting operational capability. And I'll get into a little bit more about what that means. So this is, you start to say, okay, there's really credible evidence here, and there's some real issues I need to tackle from the utility perspective. And so this graph sort of summarizes to me the mindset shift that's involved here. So this is basically the time horizon, along with the magnitude of competition. And I think most utilities across the nation, and we were asking these ones when I was in one, is the questions in red. How soon before this hits a tipping point? And blue, how much competition is there really? And I think we can sort of discredit the issue a little bit by looking at this if we say, it's 10 years out, and there's not really that much competition. But I think the more effective question here is, how long does a utility have to prepare? So if I started today, how many years is it going to take me to have a well-oiled utility 2.0 machine to compete with external entities? I think that's a more relevant question. And the other point here is, let's focus on preparedness, not having the exact precision of analytical forecasting. I'll tell you one thing for sure. No one's going to indicate or agree what the exact tipping point is. And any paradigm shift in any other industry, you know once it hits a tipping point, it takes off exponentially, and it's usually underestimated when it occurs. So if we know we're going to be wrong, but we see this future, let's just start to prepare for it and not focus on being exactly precise because it's going to be off. So, okay, I begin to be, I'm starting to get convinced I need to take steps. So how do I actually do this? So we take those challenges that I covered, and then these utility 1.0 principles, safety, reliability, affordability. Those are bedrock foundations of the utility industry. So how do we take both of these and put them together? And I believe these three elements capture the essence of sort of guiding principles. And really, your two pillars, the operational capability, the technical side, and the member service side, the customer side, are built into that. I think financial is just inherent in that. But the big difference here in all of this is how savvy you get or become in each one of these. So operational capability, how much do you know DG, interoperability, how much are you engaged with that? On member service, how savvy are you with knowing your customer needs, the apps, what they need, offering new services, energy as a service model. And then financial prudence, and I think this is one that we don't talk about much, is, so we talk about least cost planning and rate design, but how about things like, how do you monetize value? How do you monetize value to the customer? Or how do you consider having new revenue streams, like from fiber, to diversify your investment? So when we start going into what does this framework look like, you have the, basically from the transmission grid edge, which is where the distribution system starts and the transmission system ends, utilities pretty much have a good handle on this. But then on the distribution grid edge, this is where the competition is coming from. So how do you fill this gap? And this is what I call the DER stepping stones. And it's really not only how do you do it, but who's going to fill the gap? Is it going to come from the market side, or is it going to come from the utility-led side? And really, you can chart your own path here. So the stepping stones concept is about taking incremental steps, and you take the steps that work for your utility. There's no cookie cutter solution. And if the landscape changes, you can traverse in a different direction on these stones. That's sort of the concept of stepping stones, sort of visualize it a little bit better. So what are these stepping stones? I see three key areas: data and analytics, assets and devices, and energy management. So your intelligence, your tools, and your controls. Again, a part of simplicity is breaking stuff down, categorizing things. So you would basically say, I want to look at these list of stones, are these examples at the bottom. Well, I want to focus on energy storage, AMI, and I want to do fiber optics. And then in intelligence, I want to do load modeling and renewable energy forecasting. You get the point. You pick these stones, and this is where it all comes together. This is sort of the aha of it. So the silver shows all of your full menu of options that are available. That's going to constantly be changing and evolving throughout time. The green stones are the a la carte selections by the utility. These are the ones they make that work for their system. And so then you align that with the guiding principles. So the guiding principles both get you started, but they also create a place for ongoing alignment. Those three elements become your metrics. So what do I mean by that? Well, we say Utility X has decided we want to be more member service focused. So when that gets down from the top levels down to the working levels, they say, okay, well that means deciding between a community solar project and volt-var optimization, I know that I want to go after community solar, at least in the near term. So you can see how the guiding principles are metrics throughout this. And there's more to this. There's scorecards and such that are connected to it. But basically, the point is having line of sight and visibility from the highest levels of utility down to the working level. And this gives visibility, not to solutions providers that they want to know where you're going to step to next, and gives visibility to the customers. How do I know you're being savvy in these areas? Where are you going with the future grid? And then this is the last step is really easy. I mean, this is just project management. Execute, go do, and refine. So that's, once you've gotten to this stage, this is pretty straightforward. So that's it. I think the point here I'm trying to make is I think there's technical analysis is good, but I think you have to start with, where am I going, and what's that direction, to give a lot of visibility to the market. And frankly, I think this is a big market gap that does not exist currently. Thank you.
Neil, thank you very much. We will move on to Mr. Cooke.
Thank you, Chairman Hawk. Before I get started, I wanted to give a call out to my co-author, Juliet Homer. She was scheduled to present this paper today. Some of you may have noticed that on Monday the agenda changed and it was me. She fell ill and I was asked to step in, so call out to Juliet. A little bit of the agenda, what I'm going to talk about. I'll give you a little bit of background of what the DOE and us at the National Labs, what we're working on. Then I'll segue into some of the distribution planning stuff, what the traditional distribution planning looked like, some of the challenges that are arising, and then some of the ways that utilities are starting to deal with these challenges and some of the practices that we're seeing evolving in the marketplace today. So DOE has a large grid modernization initiative. I'm sure that most of you have heard something about this. It's a 5-year program. It's a large project. I'm specifically involved in the one at the bottom, the major bullet near the bottom, the Grid Modernization Lab Consortium, GMLC, as we like to call it. It's a collaboration among 14 national laboratories. It includes PUCs and utilities and all sorts of other people. It's a large process. A little bit of this is in detail the project that I'm working with. You can see the expected outcomes in the interest of time. I'm not going to read those. I'll leave that. It'll be on your website for you to see. Michael Coddington, who we heard from earlier, is a part of this team. Juliet and Lisa Schwartz from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. It's a cross lab function. What our goal is to eventually be resources to you, the regulators. Here are some other resources that are currently available now. We have a summary of distribution planning activities in some of the leading states and another one that actually focuses on DERs. Upcoming, there's a distribution planning training for commissioners that's going to be co-hosted by the labs and NARUC. And there's this other project that I wanted to call out, the DSPX project, that actually was initiated by commissions, and DOE is sponsoring it, and some of the labs are helping it. You can see there's a 3-volume set there that I just call out the titles and a hot link where you can actually find this information. So, segueing into the traditional distribution planning. I think we've heard a lot about it. The prior panel talked about this. There are only a couple things I really want to talk about. First of all, it really focused on load. So we know we have customer growth in this area and we have customer growth in this area, and we need to build facilities to meet that. And we want to make sure that we can meet the load with the reliability criteria that we have to meet. Cost containment is big. And we also, as we develop our resource plans for the distribution system, we want to make sure that as our assets get old, that we are replacing them. So that's kind of the traditional planning. It has worked for 100 years. Now what we see with high concentrations of DERs coming in is that it starts to not work quite so well. And there's a list of issues there that were taken from an IEEE document. I think we heard quite a bit about these, so I'm not going to really go into them, especially since I'm the economist and I don't want to betray the fact that I'm not the engineer. But these issues are really starting to drive utilities to think about new ways to do their planning. Just looking at the planning that has been going on across the country, there are some benefits that are coming out of this that maybe people didn't necessarily think would be coming out of it when they went into it. One of which is that a lot of these have tended to be processes collaborative between the utilities with large stakeholder involvement processes. I think you were talking to the utilities yesterday asking about whether they were interested in collaborating more than they currently do. And I think this might be an area where they can do just that. Because of the collaboration and all the transparency, when the utilities come to you, the regulator, you probably will know more about how they arrived at that distribution plan that they're bringing to you. So there are a lot of benefits in that regard. There are other benefits when you start getting all these distributed energy resources on your system. One of which is you don't have to always think only about building more wires and more substations and more transformers. You might actually be able to start thinking about how you can control some of the generation that already exists in your distribution system and institute some of the non-wire solutions, which I think Chris mentioned earlier today. Some of the elements that we're starting to see of this planning framework as it's evolving, one of which is that load that you're building for out there is no longer a load that you're just counting how many houses there are and how many commercial buildings there are and saying, I know what the load shape of these guys are, and here's the load. Now you have to start to take into account if there's a lot of solar out there, that load is going to be varying up and down. It's not going to be that nice load shape you used to have. So you see people starting to take into account some of this variability in their planning processes. There's another thing that we really think is important, which is scenario-based distribution planning. Again, it's not just one forecast anymore. If you think that solar is going to be in fashion at the federal government and suddenly tax credits are going to go up dramatically, that might be a completely different scenario. If you think that suddenly solar and other renewable resources are going to fall out of favor and tax credits are going to go away, that might be another scenario. So we've been talking in terms of at least 3 scenarios to assess your future and your distribution system. There are some other studies that have been talked about at great length that we're starting to see more and more of: hosting capacity, the interconnection studies, looking at the value of distributed resources depending on where it is on your system, because it's not going to be the same value in all places. And the final bullet here, I'm going to go to the next slide and talk about. This is a slide that we borrowed from a process in Minnesota. In the blue, or in the box over in the left bottom, you see the distribution planning. And you have the current distribution assessment, which is what we've been doing for the last 100 years. And you see the new studies that are more and more being done, the hosting capacity. But there's this annual long-term distribution planning box that we've highlighted there that has arrows going up to the resource planning and the transmission planning. I think as you see more and more distributed resources on your system, these become more and more issues and possible resources for the transmission and the resource system. They're no longer just part of the distribution system, but they might actually be resources that you look to in your integrated resource planning process or your transmission planning process. So it becomes more and more important that there be consistency between these processes and that they pass information back and forth. The only other thing I'll just mention is that all 3 of these plannings, whether the transmission planning or the IRP or the resource planning process and the distribution plan, all they are processes to get you a roadmap so you know what your investment future looks like. So you know where you need to buy things and build things and how much it's going to be. One more thing I would add to this, it doesn't take place in a vacuum. You have state policies for renewable resources. You have the regulatory policies for, maybe to implement the state policies for renewable resources, but also other policies, the reliability criteria and other policies. So the utility planning isn't taking place in a vacuum. It has to take into account all of these other things. This one since I know I'm going to start running out of time before too much longer, I'm going to really focus only on one thing here, and I think it dovetails with something we heard earlier, and that's the second major bullet, the first sub-bullet underneath there, where it says the first step in distribution system planning, moving into this future, is to walk the line. What that really means is to make sure that you know what your assets are and make sure that you're getting all of your assets into your models. I was looking at a PowerPoint that I believe was an EPRI PowerPoint done for the investor-owned utilities in New York, talking about doing, I think it was hosting studies, but it was one of those types of studies like that. And the point that it made was that if you look at any utilities distribution planning model, it's not going to have all of the feeders in it. It might actually not even have a majority of the feeders in it, and it might not be having, it might actually be modeling the components of those feeders at some sort of midpoint settings. So it's kind of important that you can start to flesh out your whole system and get your whole system into this planning process. I tell you, this one was beaten half to death yesterday, so I'm going to try to be quick with this one. You talked a lot about how the sensors and the measurement and the data are all expensive and how you're getting a lot of data and using a small part of it. What this is really just trying to say is that before you really go out and start building a lot of sensors and a lot of measurement, make sure that you know where you want to go. What kind of studies are you really going to be needing to do in your planning? The idea here is to avoid that buyer's remorse where you just spent $500 million on something that you really aren't getting $500 million worth of value out of. Since I know that I'm getting low on time, I'm going to skip forward about 3 slides to here. This is possible places to start, taking some early integration steps. I think I agree with something that somebody said earlier today, and I'm not sure which one of the speakers. Even though we heard yesterday you don't have a lot of solar going in Ohio, and you're just really not getting a lot of the DERs yet, they're coming. I think it's not really a matter of if, it's a matter of when, where, and how much. So, you have time now to take some of the early integration steps so that when you hit that tipping point that Neil was talking about a little while ago, you're actually already on the ground and running. So getting some consistency between your planning processes, getting scenarios and modeling methods so you can forecast just how much of that DER you think you're going to get and where you're going to get it and when you're going to get it, getting those pieces on the ground and running. Accounting for all of those resources. There's a long list of DERs between the solar, the batteries, the electric vehicles, your DSM, and they're all different. You have to model them different. So it's important to start getting them all identified so that you can figure out how to model them in your distribution planning models. And also figuring out ways to do some of the analyzing of possible futures. The last point here is just consider conservation voltage reductions in VVO, which you've talked about quite a bit. This would be a second thought for where you might start, phasing in some of the hosting capacity studies that you've heard a lot about. Somebody asked, I think it was Commissioner Conway asked if it would be good to have a pilot. It might very well be a good use of time and money to run some pilots to study some of these things and to really dive into how you do it and get that all figured out. And I think I'm going to stop right there because even though I haven't seen the time sign, I know that she's got to be just about ready to hold that up. Well, actually, I'm going to talk for half a second about that last bullet because I do think it's important. And that is, a lot of the talk yesterday about data really was operational data and it was customer data, which is not necessarily the same thing as the data that's used in your planning models. All 3 of those data sources might be the same meters and the same monitors. The thing here is, a possible place to start is as you identify what data you're collecting and where it's coming from, to make sure that you have the processes in place to make sure that it flows to your planning models. Now I'm going to stop.
Alan, thank you very much. Joshua.
That will actually time myself. Thank you very much, Chairman Huck. Good morning, commissioners and staff. Opus One is a software engineering company. Our mission is to enhance the customer experience via a DER-enabled grid of the future. So we strongly believe in a DER-enabled grid. And currently, we are deploying such solutions across thousands of feeders, impacting over billions of dollars of capital planning budgets using advanced analytics and data sets. So Neil, right before me, talked about Grid 1.0 and 2.0. We break it down to three stages. From the grid of yesterday, which is more of a top-down, one-way pipeline type of business model, to today, Epri talked a lot about accommodating to integrating. So today is a lot about the DERs getting more and more mature, price points coming down, and utilities being asked to accommodate more DERs. I think where we are going tomorrow is more of, as you have more DERs, can we set up the platform to, one, integrate such DERs, including the values, and number two, generate the right value signals so that the platform itself becomes a pull towards a greater attractiveness towards DERs. And three, leverage that type of platform models for customer engagement so they are no longer a passive load, but an active participant that transacts value with the network at large. We talked a lot about defection and various death spirals, for example, but from our side, we strongly believe in the power of networking. Just like what we learned about the internet or social media, every single resource is that much more valuable when they are networked together. Currently, the grid is a power system, energy, physical network. The smart grid is a data and intelligence network, but where are we going in terms of transactive energy is a value-based network. That being said, as Chris was just talking this morning, the grid in itself is blind. Even with AMI data, AMI reveals a lot of data at the customer side per home or per building, but the grid itself is still blind and in many ways aging and congested. And what is blind, you cannot see with visibility. The grid itself is so blind that a back of the envelope calculation reveals that it is less than 0.1% visible on any distribution feeder. So what is blind, you cannot see. What you can't see, you can't really control. What type of smart inverters, etc. How can that be controlled? And what you can't control, you can't optimize. The bulk power system is highly optimized, various location and marginal pricing, optimal power flow signals. But distribution system is typically operated as cost recovery. We build it, we run it, we recover our cost. How do we optimize the operation of that infrastructure and how things are being generated and consumed? And then what cannot be optimized can't be valuated. I know we are just building a bridge in this panel towards valuation and various compensations, but the reality is in bulk power, valuation is based upon optimization. I'm highlighting the chain reaction of events that needs to happen from visibility to now valuation, which then finally unlocks new ways of business models with both utilities and customers so that we can achieve a win-win type of integrative markets or business dynamics. So it's a whole chain reaction. There's no easy shortcuts. In reality, this is where the grid is today. But the good news is technology is ready to make that happen, to bring the various stakeholders in the grid along an evolutionary path towards this new integrative business model. How we do it is typically off a 5-layer framework, so we integrate with the various data sets and intelligence that exist today, customer information, SCADA, DMS, etc. A situational awareness layer needs to be built first, largely based on state estimation, basically taking minimal visibility on the grid to maximum awareness of what's going on, and the key lies in a model, and the model was highlighted previously with Alan as well. So gaining full awareness on what's happening on the grid in real time and in forecast. Number 2 reflects the control piece, so managing the constraints around hosting capacity especially. Number 3 is we can then optimize using full-on power flow, 3-phase unbalanced power flow on distribution systems, which is a rare thing today. 4th is upon optimization, we can start looking at valuation and various business models under the general name of transactive energy. Last but not least, cutting across all layers, we need to make sure that the system is dynamic, because in reality, distribution system switches all the time. And when distribution systems switch, then all power flow, all constraints, all optimization, all value signals such as pricing needs to be updated along with that type of switching behavior. And this is not just for the grid itself, this is trying to manage the network, but it parallels on the right-hand side of this diagram with the DER business models. For example, if there are no controls, let's say a wind or solar, we can only accommodate or manage the constraints on the grid. But if there are controls, for example, a contract with a demand response program, a microgrid, storage, perhaps even utility owned, there can be direct control to basically set a technical set point, optimal set point to that resource. That being said, not every resource can be directly controlled. So learning from various bulk power markets, etc., is going towards indirect controls, basically value-based or price-based controls to incent a certain behavior, clear it, settle it, and allow people to commit upon it. So that's our overall strategy to manage, leverage, optimize DERs on the network. And what that gives you is really unlocking the true value and stacked values of DERs, that they are not just a nuance or nuisance on the grid, nice to have to achieve sustainable targets, but going beyond just environmental sustainability into technical and economic sustainability around DERs. And currently today, there are silos of value captured behind the meter, on the grid, and on the bulk power system. Now, the proper way to stack these values then is to break down these silos and look at specifically locational, perhaps marginal and temporal values across behind the meter, the distribution grid as the emerging platform, and the bulk power system. Another parallel architecture from the DOE ENERGISE program rolled out about a year and a half, 2 years ago. 4-layer framework. The bottom is the devices, then telecom and data, the smart grid type of layer, then the traditional systems layer, basically enterprise data, warehouses, and analytics. Now there is an interesting enhanced system layer that DOE has highlighted, which are emerging functionalities that are in, I would say, late research or early commercialization phase that are required to enable and leverage these DER values for both planning, operations, and markets. And the definitions here is really around advanced methods to model, simulate, and predict power system behaviors, power flow, optimal power flow, state estimation, all the technical terms that's really required to basically open up the full stacked values of DERs. So I'm going to spend the rest of my presentation on 3 case studies that we have been deploying. That's, I would say, relatively leading edge in this industry. One's in operation, the other is in planning, and the third is in emerging business models. The number one is on operations. So this is with a decent investor-owned utility in the East Coast around DER operations under high penetration, but going from just accommodating DERs to using them for resiliency, literally microgrid services on the feeder scale or utility scale. So there's 6 megawatts of wind on a world-long distribution feeder. Reliability is low. Power quality is not ideal at all. And there is a mine in the middle of the feeder, while the wind farm is at the end of the feeder. And there's a good high net worth residential neighborhood scattered throughout as well. So the project that we are embarking on is to deploy a large battery storage system at the substation to work alongside with the wind generation to look at power quality, peak reduction, renewable integration, but also a full-on feeder level utility scale microgrid to essentially island the feeder and that community and working using the wind and the battery in times of outage, either on the sub-transmission line or further downstream on the distribution system. So we're looking at advanced operational techniques such as power flow, real-time power flow with state estimation, optimal dispatch of the battery storage, microgrid management that's tied in with the switching of the feeder, and really using the value signals with the DERs for operation. really for operational optimization of those battery assets at the substation and in those homes. So this is a bit of a very well integrated project with DER storage, microgrids, and even tying it into a bit of transactive energy with value signals. I think case study number two is the most important, probably the most applicable for Ohio today. Reason being, not everyone have high DER penetrations. Not everyone needs to move to new market forces immediately, but everyone is looking at planning around DERs. They are a new tool in the box that can be cost effective and cost competitive, and customers are really asking for that as well. And furthermore, it achieves sustainable and environmental targets. So planning is really the name of the game today, but traditional planning is inadequate for DERs. It's a siloed process between transmission planning and DER planning. There's a huge chasm in between. Traditional focus on top-down, typically one snapshot, worst case based planning. I plan for once, lots of data, worst case scenario, lasts me a few years. It's focused on forecasting or capacity planning, power quality, reliability, asset health, contingency, automation, etc. But the DER side is really a connection queue. It's an interconnection process, a bit of forecasting, impact studies, looking at new technologies such as smart inverters, microgrids, emerging role of aggregators, value that they can capture on typically the bulk power market, for example, as virtual power plants, and policy impacts. So how do we tie them together? And this is the project where we are deploying it across over 4,000 feeders, impacting over $1 billion of capital investment. And how we tie them together is really leveraging the locational value of DERs. Because once we can quantify the locational value of DERs, we can tie that into a capital planning process. And so it's a scalable metric, and including into that planning process, hosting capacity impacts that's forecasted as a time series. And that also leads to the discovery of non-wires alternatives. So it's not one community at a time, but it's really part of the regular planning process. And each time, because we are quantifying it in economic terms as well, that leads to investment strategy and risk analysis. And when we finish that on the integrated distribution planning side, then we can either handshake with higher order generation and transmission planning, or have a full single pass optimization across vertically across the system. So this is a high priority that we see today. Then last but not least, just a glimpse into new business models in case study 3. This is something we're deploying under New York Rev around new business models. So that's really around the platform business models. Again, really exposed by the value of DERs and then transacting that value as grid services with the NDERs. And we believe that by leveraging efficiencies on the grid, quantifying those values and transacting those values, we can finally achieve a win-win type of business model between utilities and DERs. How we do it on the valuation side is actually based on distribution level, location marginal pricing, taking bulk power system down to distribution level. So in conclusion, I think it's an exciting time for sure of transformation. A platform model is the way to go in not just a poles and wires and oil type of physical platform, then to a smart grid platform, but a value transaction type of platform with the end customer. We have a long way to go. There's many processes. There's a chain reaction from visibility, control, optimization, valuation to business models. But technology is opening up the way, and Opus One is thrilled to be partnering with Power Forward to make this happen. Thank you very much.
Joshua, thank you very much for that presentation. Chris, did you want to jump in and just opine upon what you heard?
Sure. So, first of all, everything Alan said, I think I've either been part of or completely agree with everything that was in his presentation on thinking of how regulatory, how the impacts of this on planning go. So I think the discussions from this session can be broken down into just a couple of things. The need for planning clearly is in there, because as DERs continue to show up, you should plan for it. In Ohio, like many other states, have the ability to start the planning system now in advance of the impacts of distributed energy resources. And then part of the planning comes with an understanding of the system needs. But it's not only that. An important component in thinking about how planning fits is how does it fit with the other planning processes that are already ongoing? How does it fit with the transmission planning process? How does it fit with an integrated resource planning process? How does it fit with everything else that the utilities are already planning for? How do you put those together? In thinking about how this was being done, you also have to have a realization of what comes in what order. So in my opinion, at the end of the day, several years from now, it's going to be the distribution system planning function is going to drive the other components, as opposed to traditionally transmission planning goes down to IRP and then distribution. I think it's going to eventually flip. The second thing I heard is part of the understanding is also developing the pilots. I have a personal hard time with the word pilot because pilot connotates a beginning and an end, and the end then results in a couple years of reviewing the pilot study. When what we're talking about now is that we don't really have that ability to stop an investment to meet something that's been enabled. So how do you, instead of doing pilots, how do you do rollouts, phase and limited rollouts, so that as the lessons get learned over time, instead of just stopping the successful pilot, you can keep it moving. And if it's an unsuccessful pilot, well, then you haven't invested a tremendous amount of money. And the third one, which is clearly an important topic, but more delved in for later, is valuation. The values of these resources are very dependent on location and the time. And understanding that component as you go into the planning and the pilots is just something that has to be recognized. And then how you deal with the compensation and values of it is a very different discussion that is subject to phase 3. So I think the panel discussions, this one and the one before, clearly lead us into a direction of where you want to go for phase 3, and this provides hopefully a good foundation for those discussions.
Very good, thank you. Let's begin with staff questions. Christina?
So as I think most folks are aware, Ohio is a restructured state. We don't do traditional integrated resource planning like we have historically. So I guess one of my questions surrounds what are the opportunities that exist or have been obtained in other areas for distribution system planning and non-wires alternatives when generation is generally considered to be a competitive asset? And kind of what nuances does that throw in, and how can those problems be solved?
I'll take a first minuscule cut at it, which is that one thing I recall reading not too long ago, there in a document written by somebody who I would call kind of an advocacy group, really advocating for DERs, and I don't remember who they were. I think what they were saying was that there really haven't been a lot of utilities that have really done what you might call any kind of long-term use of DERs or whatever it might be for a non-wire solution. But what you have seen are utilities that have used DERs or whatever for somewhat short-term ones. So we know we're going to need a new substation in 2 or 3 years, and we can get by for a while using these non-wire solutions. But ultimately, I think they ended up building the substation. So it's just used as a bridging mechanism more than anything else. So I don't think that really answers your question, because you're trying to link it to resource planning, but that's what I've seen so far with using these for non-wire solutions.
So I can add my 2 cents. So I think instead of an IRP, we are really looking at an IDP, integrated distribution planning, or some other states call it a DRP process, or so the DSIP process in New York, for example. I think what we're learning a lot is why we need to change is because we cannot treat DERs as just another program. I think demand response was a program, is a regulated program. There's assumed value signals with that. Feed-in tariffs, net metering, etc. All of these are programs. But if we actually see even DERs, just like generators, are competitive in nature, which means their value can be positive or negative. Their values can change over time. So how do we have more sophisticated ways to integrate them as competitive to not just with the bulk power generators, but with distribution level investments as well? How we are tackling it is with evaluation methodologies, but also not just, again, a snapshot traditional type of worst case analysis, but a time series forecast. So can I actually forecast this feeder's load and generation over the course of what we're doing is 10 years time? Can we look at how additional generation can offset the need for capital around like power quality, capacity, peak loads, etc.? What's the cost like? But now the real trick is DERs are not necessarily controllable as a lot of centralized generation or like an asset which you just increase the pipeline. So which means the new emerging planning practices should take into account not just a further time horizon as a time series type of calculation, but even taking probabilistic analyses and stochastic analyses into it to take into account the random behavior and the changing outputs of various DERs. So it will be complicated, but the good thing is that tools are emerging to be able to solve that.
Okay. Very good. Christina, anything else?
Just to follow up, I guess that locational value, I mean, is that better done? It seems like something that would be non-productive to do state by state. I mean, has comments on that in general, I guess?
Well, that's the role of the aggregator. If there's value at the wholesale market, the aggregator would come and identify the value. When you're talking about distribution system planning and you're talking about distribution value, which is going to be different than the wholesale value, then that is going to be done distribution system by distribution system. And what Josh was talking about is the reason why, in the end, the integrated distribution system plan ends up being the thing that's the most important thing the utility ends up doing. California, while not a retail choice state, is restructured. They are now starting an IRP process now. They are now considering whether or not, how do all these disparate pieces start to fit together in the distribution system planning? How does the utility manage and understand how all these things are working together? And furthermore, California, while they again don't have a traditional retail choice, they functionally have competition, just not in the traditional way of thinking about it, because now people can go up and install rooftop solar. Tesla's providing solar and storage. Demand response is becoming a competitive state resource. Efficiency will eventually become a competitive state resource. So they're eventually breaking all these pieces out of the traditional utility and putting that out into the market. And now the utility has to take it all back and plan for it and then value and price it.
Can I add another perspective as well, just to build on Chris's point? I agreed. I think a lot of people right now take shortcuts in understanding the value of DERs by just aggregating them to the bulk power market. But in reality, the bulk power market only reflects the values that can be captured in the bulk power system. Generation offsets, loss reductions, congestion reductions, etc. But many people acknowledge that, hey, the distribution system was the last few miles, the platform to enable all the new innovation to happen. That's actually the most constraint. That's actually where capital budgets are soaring, and that's what's limiting a lot of the innovations that the customers in the DERs want to have. So how do we capture that piece of value in translating that to the DERs?
Hey, thank you. Tim? Mahila?
This is a question for Joshua. Joshua, this distributed energy resource management platform, if that's an accurate way to term your product, how does it work with the larger platform that a utility will deploy for the rest of the traditional, technologies and for the communications? Does it work alongside that platform, or does it fit in like an application in that platform?
Yeah. So clarification first. The DERM system, or the Distributed Energy Resource Management System, is one of the applications of what we do, especially on the operational side, not the planning side. DERMS is typically tied to operation, but that at the same time is probably the number one buzzword in the industry today. And there are, in our books, 6 different streams of definitions of what a DERMS can be. So that can be a separate discussion or presentation as well. But essentially, if we consolidate them and find commonalities amongst them, the Durham's platform will likely work alongside a distribution management system, either as a part of an ADMS or in complement to a DMS or a DSCADA. That also builds ties with the aggregator and aggregation platforms and potentially with an interface with markets. So there is a looking down portion towards the DERs and interfacing with the DERs, perhaps becoming a bit of a pseudo aggregation system itself. There is a tie to the grid management systems, DMS, ADMS. There's a tie upwards towards any type of market platform.
Thank you. Commissioner Friedman.
Chris, I guess it's primarily directed to you, and feel free to chime in. Welcome to Thursday, incidentally. There's a certain poetic aspect to our agenda today. We heard, Chris, earlier today that there is an ever-growing proliferation of distributed energy resource development, and that it will happen irrespective of externalities. But to your point, Neil, planning is necessary before you get to a tipping point that becomes precipitous. So here's the question, Chris. If enterprise follows opportunity and proliferation will happen, does hosting capacity provide a natural limiter on the speed with which this will occur so that there can be a contemporaneous endeavor to do planning? Because basically we are all charged ultimately, and I hate to use a cliched expression, to do what we can to assure that the juice is worth the squeeze.
So, Commissioner, hosting capacity, I wouldn't view it as a limiter. It's a data source. It's a data source to the investments. The distribution grid is capable of handling some amount of power input at any given point in time. If a place is constrained, and if it, presuming, so the place is constrained, then you're not going to put a generator, but you can put something else paired with a generator. You can put storage. Or you can identify where demand response can be paired with a generator so that the impacts become minimal or de minimis. It also sends a signal to the market of where to invest resources, just the same way as locational marginal prices, the wholesale market, send us signals to where to invest in more transmission or generation. Having the information of what is capable of being integrated, interconnected at a point, is an important value point to understand where to put investments on the market side. And it does help in the organization of where to place things.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
I'll add one comment to that, and I think so. Just to reinforce a point that we look for technical solutions, and there's ways to leverage the customer as well in that conversation. So hosting capacity, if you notice that a certain part of your feeder system is overloaded, it's in the red, but you may happen to have a part of your neighborhood that really they start seeing their neighbors putting solar on solar. So what do you do with that? And I think it's a data tool to be able for you to craft and say, okay, we're going to put a community solar project on this part of the grid system. That's going to be cheaper for you, no maintenance, and it's lower cost. And this is why we're doing it. And so then they know where they're going technically, but they're also caring about the customer and me. So I think there's abilities to leverage that and synergy and bring more of the customer into that conversation.
Resource allocation.
Mr. Trumbull?
I don't really have a question. I just have an observation. I thought, Neil, you brought up a really good point about this human factor and how it gets lost, and how it does play a critical role in possibly rolling out DER. And so I just appreciate that insight. Thank you.
Commissioner Johnson. Nothing. Commissioner Conway.
Joshua, you mentioned locational value as being I think you did, mention it as being an important factor for you in determining whether to invest in a DER. How do you, if I got that correctly, how do you determine locational value, or what do you need the utility to do or the regulatory commission to do to enable you to figure out locational value so that you can make your decision.
This might be a fast forward to phase 3, but what we're relying on a lot is the model of the grid. So without a model, just like bulk power, we can't. If we don't know what assets there are, we don't know what power flow is happening, then there's no way of understanding the benefits that DERs can have on the system. But if we have the model and even the slightest bit of data from smart metering or SCADA, etc., we know how our DER can offset any peaks, for example, can reduce losses, can increase hosting capacity as a constraint relief type of resource. Each resource has its own characteristics and services to the grid as well. Let's just, for example, a battery storage system will have a much wider flexibility and options to provide services to the grid versus a passive solar system. Demand response have only one way of curtailing demand, whereas a battery can be a 4-quadrant assets doing both volts and watts and vars type of services. So by tying the asset characteristic with its location on the grid, I would even say phase on the grid as well, to see how that mitigates against peaks, power flow, losses, etc. That captures the value to the distribution grid itself. Then you continue stacking of, okay, how does this benefit the customer behind the meter? Or how can that then be aggregated towards an even higher level bulk power system values? But the distribution system side itself will require distribution level data.
And is it the utility that develops the model that you then use to extract these consequences from?
It will be the utility, or if there is an option for DSO or in discussion, then whoever owns the network data will be able to derive that value. It is completely in parallel with what's happening on the bulk power system.
Okay, so we'll bridge somewhat this afternoon's panels on energy storage. Okay, so let's bridge somewhat into phase 3 then, because I think some of you have sort of pecked around the edges of this. So let's just have a conversation about it. So so far, at least with the first few days, and I've already described this already, we've had some education about the infrastructure necessary to create the platform, and then these panels have talked about the platform, which is of course like this is going to be like the Power Forward drinking game. Like if you ever want to rewatch the webcast, anytime someone says Power Forward, go ahead, or anytime someone says platform, go ahead. But how we have been thinking about this concept of the platform is this, and I keep going back to the Jeff Taft's DSPX slide, these sort of core elements, and then there's the gray line, and then there's what's above that, which is the application piece. And we spent a lot of time talking about the core elements. What you guys have done is gotten us to start thinking about the end-use application elements and what's necessary to allow for end-use applications to also to advance, and I think that's a pretty necessary conversation as well. So for this was a great panel that Neil, I think what you helped us try and do with respect to DERs was think about how to attack the problem, and we got more specific down the line with some of the Joshua eventually with the planning element. So let's talk about sort of the marketplace a little bit, because I want to make sure that we have armed ourselves heading into phase 3 with some of the necessary pieces of the puzzle associated with the marketplace that needs to be created in order to advance this world. So we're leaving the infrastructure. We're leaving the infrastructure realm, and now we're talking about the marketplace. And so let me just ask this broad question. To advance to increase the proliferation of DERs. What in your mind, not, you don't have to get specific as to the type of marketplace that needs to be created, but what are the markets that we need to be thinking about? So, like, is the data, is all things related to data, is that its own marketplace? And then is the sort of the transaction between well, I shouldn't say whoever the platform provider is and the DER end user, is that also a marketplace? Let's start having conceptual conversations about this without being sort of too prescriptive about who the players should be and who should get compensated for what. Joshua, you're nodding your head. You want to go first?
I'm nodding my head. That's it's a good conversation, but there are no detailed specifics to reference right now because everything's in development right now. So I also advocate for not one particular market model. I think what we need to do is to capture the various value elements. So I honestly, on our side, we could care less about the market, which type of market it is, as long as we properly capture the value and tie that into how we plan and operate and work with customers. On our side, the value elements will be a few buckets. There will be a long-term values that are tied to capital infrastructure, the quote-unquote non-wires alternatives. Since those are tied to capital budgets, those tend to be high-valued elements. Also, because they are tied to capital, they tend to be more stable, static, predictable, and long-term. Can be a PPA, can be something similar. Then there are the short-run values and elements. So, for example, I talked about loss minimization. That's a short-run, basically minute by minute, if not even second by second type of phenomena. There is the peak reduction, which is more of an event-driven intraday event, maybe predicted, maybe not. With the DER such as storage, we even go into the resiliency value elements. For example, a storage can provide a community microgrid function. That's a larger social good that the storage player is providing to the grid, but not limited to that, because the grid is intricately tied. Any type of resource can even offer transfer capacity services, basically additional capacity that one feeder can transfer to another feeder that is being restored. So there are more complicated network elements associated with that. So those are the long run and short run grid service elements. But to your point, Chairman Hack, there are still other markets or services that can be played with the data. Can we hedge? Can we predict? Can we provide data analytics? On that market, if we know what can be planned, can we even provide financing, capital financing, project financing type of services? So it becomes very similar to, again, our best example is the bulk power system, in which various markets can appear to capture those values. In essence, back to your earlier comments about the platform, I see where this market is going, similar to where eBay or Amazon can go. The grid used to be a shipping and logistics company. We ship electrons. But now we are taking a trucks and boxes type of industry, and we're moving it to transactions and a marketplace for customers to transact value amongst themselves and transact value with the platform itself. So that's how I see between the infrastructure and the applications as well.
Thanks. Neil?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So, and I laid out three sort of core competencies that you could make into market. So is the data, the devices, and then the management of it. And so you could make those into markets, but I would argue that I think in the early days of this, I think looking at it more holistically and how, I think it's better to look at it holistically at first, because there's going to be synergistic value that's leveraged from putting all of these together. And I think what the market, regardless of if you're in one of those three spaces, what they're looking for is visibility from the utilities, not only in price signals, but in vision, like we are committing to do this. And I think that would not only help the market to build the partnership with the utilities, but it would help the utilities because most I know, 100 different solutions providers are knocking at their door and they don't know who to talk to about which or what this. But if they laid out sort of the stepping stones of in year one, we are doing this. This is what we're doing. And then they can focus the conversation with those folks. So I think the visibility of it, I think, is a key thing. So it's not necessarily market segregation or separation. It's more about giving visibility to the market of where you're headed.
Okay. Alan, Chris, you want to jump in?
I just wanted to briefly add, I think we've talked quite a bit about this already, but there are a lot of players out there who I think really just want to know where can I go easily, quickly, and some of the studies that we've talked about quite a bit already today, like the hosting study, I mean, that really gives that information to people who want to sell solar and who want it to be painless and fast. So just getting some of that information, I think that might be, at least in part, what Neil was talking about with the visibility, but, that's probably not where he was going. There's just a lot of little things that we can do, and I think utilities are really, really good at assessing. I mean, we're really good with numbers, let's face it. The numbers are us. So we're really good at calculating benefits and costs, and maybe if we get into a mode where we start looking for resources, a small scale, we can start, buying DERs ourselves with the money that we have decided these are worth based on our benefit cost analyses, using some of the value streams that Josh was just talking about.
So one way that I was thinking about it is to go back to John McDonald's statements around identification of functions of the grid. Because when you identify the functions of the grid, you can then break those apart as to what could be competitively procured and what shouldn't be competitively procured. So something like reliability, traditionally that's a utility function and the only utility can do that. Well, we know technologies are out there that are on the consumer side of the meters that can enhance and provide reliability services. Now it becomes a difficult question because reliability is the core competency of the utility, and now you're asking them to rely on somebody else to help meet that core competency. But it's a value when it's sitting out there and it's not just under monetized, it's not monetized at all. So identification of the functions and the requirements and the outcomes you want of the grid as the system or the network can then go forward and figure out which one of these things can be procured, how can you value them. When you have, if you were at NARUC and sat in the EV rate discussion, you heard one of the Southern California Edison guys talking about locational distribution prices. Not just the kWh for generation, the provision of the distribution price. So that reflects, again, how the nature of the distribution system is also going to be undergoing an evolution. We're building on the hosting capacity. Now, maybe you want to send not just information, an actual price signal, because you've identified the functions of the system that are valuable to society.
Okay, very good. Any other questions?
Let me see if I understand, Chris. Locational distribution pricing, like a concrete example of that. So where you're reaching the constraint under the hosting capacity capability, does that indicate that there's some distribution locational price that's higher than places where you're not reaching a constraint? Is that the idea?
Yes.
Okay.
So if you've unbundled the rates as they've been, consumers are generally getting the variable price on the generation. Now you can, when you have the right amount of technology and visibility system, you can set a variable price for the distribution as well.
Okay. Panelists, thank you very much. You did a wonderful job. Really appreciate it.